Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce, where on this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're talking about Ukraine and Russia with my guest, Mark Nelson. He's the managing director of the Radiant Energy Fund. Mark, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Good to be here, Robert.
So I just, let's get this out of the way. Introduce yourself, please, just very quickly. I know you've been on this your third time, I believe, on the podcast, but just give us a quick intro.
Sure. I'm from Oklahoma.
Amen, brother. Go.
Nuclear
Boomer
medical.
Wave the wheat, all that.
My mother is in nuclear medicine. My father's in oil and gas. I went to school for engineering and Russian language and literature. And then I did my graduate studies over in the UK in nuclear energy. I work in environmental advocacy for a lot of my day. And in doing that, I'm trying to save nuclear plants from closure, communicate about them to the public, and maybe get a few new ones built.
Well, let's jump right in. We talked a few months ago, and one of the things I remember you saying was people, in industries, companies all over the world now are just looking for anything that hydrocarbons to burn. And we saw the beginning of price increases, but tell us what we've seen just in the last day or so with the price spikes, both in natural gas at TTF, the Dutch trading hub, and then Newcastle coal in Australia.
Sure. Newcastle coal, which was trading not far from 2008 all-time highs last autumn, around the just under $200 a ton, has now jumped up in today's trading to $435 a ton.
Which just on its face is incredible and puts the lie to this whole idea of, beyond coal and we don't need coal anymore. That's the fuel of the past, when in reality, the countries of the world again are burning whatever they can to produce the electricity they need. And this is a function, because of Russia as a big coal producer, and what are the drivers here?
There's energy in it, and it can move by ship. On our podcast, as you mentioned, we said that when things get tight, anything that burns is going to be burned. We warned people. We said it's coming. Did we expect war to break out? No, but it's not completely independent. Without the fossil fuel crisis, it's not at all clear that Russia would have chosen this time to invade.
Well, so explain that. Without the fossil fuel crisis, that Russia knew that they had Europe in a box, and that was the key. And this is the other thing I wanted to talk about. And again, my guest, Mark Nelson, it makes me think, and I've written about this in my latest book, one of the first things that when invading countries do is destroy the country's energy infrastructure, in particular the electricity grid. But we haven't seen that with Russia invading Ukraine. Why not?
They haven't touched it, presumably because they don't need to.
That they assumed that they could take over without having to take out big transformers, power lines, etc.
Yeah, I think they're just trying to come in and sub out top leadership. That's it.
But so far, I mean, I don't know what to believe. And you made this point on your Twitter feed about, the news about different power plants, the Zaporizhia power plant, with the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, 5.7 gigawatts. That there's, information from the Russians, information from the Ukrainians. We don't know really who to believe, but the power plants haven't been touched. They haven't been attacked, presumably because Putin thought, well, I'll just roll in, replace the leadership, and then everything's going to be fine. I'll keep the existing energy infrastructure. But the other part of it is that the EU and the US have said, well, we're not going to blow up their pipelines or anything else, because they knew that would sabotage their own economies. Is that fair?
Yeah. Russia needs the money from European natural gas sales so much less than Europe needs the natural gas.
Explain that. How do you mean?
Yeah. Well, natural gas sales are just a fraction of the hydrocarbon sales that Russia has. They've been getting decent money up to this point. They declined to put any optional natural gas on the market starting last autumn, which in hindsight was the sign that they were preparing Europe, softening up all of Europe for invasion. They just stopped selling natural gas. They just didn't want to. Europe hadn't signed long-term contracts. Russia didn't deliver. That was up to Russia. The retailer has a right not to offer goods on the public market, and they didn't. So uh, Europe needed the gas. The money to pay for it is good to have, but if Russia can't spend it outside of Russia anyway, wouldn't really matter if they were looking at invading. So again, from the perspective of Russia, the no matter how many people in Russia actually knew the invasion was happening, the only one who needed to know clearly was Putin. He planned for it on energy. Europe didn't have an alternative to natural gas, certainly not in the short run. Right. Almost all of its energy policy was oriented towards gas. Russian gas was by far the cheapest, right? So Russian gas was the cheapest. Europe had already oriented around it. Could it have gone better for Putin? Yeah, sure. There could have been more cold weather. There is a quite warm and mild winter. There's been really good wind for all of January and February until now. Now there's bad wind, but sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. And I guess Europe has had a good hand there. It was good, but then they have got a bad hand because the wind stopped. So hydrocarbon sales are exploding from a high base to all-time highs. And that's Europe's problem. They don't have the physical energy they need, regardless of the money they're going to be willing to spend on it.
Well, let's talk about that price and I want to come back to the pipeline gas because of the Power of Siberia pipeline, which connects China now to Russia. But that's
the other thing. Russia has other markets for the oil and gas.
Right.
Because prices are high around the world, countries like China and India are trying to figure out whether they're willing to starve their countries on behalf of Ukraine. And they're looking at it and they're like,
not so much.
Probably going to let Europe sort this one out.
Right. So according to Trading Economics, this is a great website for commodity prices of all kinds. The price of Dutch gas, the TTF trading hub, which is the main trading hub in Europe, the European equivalent of Henry Hub, prices today are $173 per million BTUs. It's a price increase of $58 in a day. It's a 60% increase 50% increase roughly in one day. Which just staggers.
Behind.
Oh,
you're behind.
Okay. Sorry. Tell me what's the latest?
It's just below 200 euros per megawatt hour.
Okay, well that's in megawatt hours. Okay, I'm talking about in million BTUs. The TTF is they're on Trading Economics. They denominate it in MMBTUs because that to me it's easier to not have to convert to megawatt hours. But nevertheless.
Apologies. For me, it's one step closer to going into my specialty, which is electricity. Well, then let me give something
back
go ahead. To you then
for
that mistake. At about 194 euros per megawatt hour, plus the carbon price, which look, the carbon trading scheme has got just days to live, in my opinion. It's hard to see how the carbon scheme survives unless the European Union has decided they need that extra little price signal to
starve consumers of power.
At this point, I don't know. Is it extra rationing or I really can't tell whether it's going to survive. I presume it won't. At the moment, at the current price of carbon, that makes the Newcastle coal not $80 per megawatt hour as fuel in European coal plants. It makes it about $180 a megawatt hour. And for the carbon, it instead of making it about let's see, I guess it'd be about $320 per megawatt hour for the natural gas only costs, like just the cost of the fuel as burned per megawatt hour of electricity, about 300 or 20. If you add the carbon, it takes us up to about $350, $360 a megawatt hour
on the wholesale market,
and
not
the
delivered
wind
to the
is
customer.
Down now. The wind is down now, so we don't know how much power is needing to be generated at sort of the long-term contracted price and how much is jumping up because of needing sales now. But look, I had a trusted, very smart friend in London who's in financing, and he called me up yesterday and he said, "It's over, right? I don't see how it's not over." And I'm like, "Hold up, what do you mean?" He said, our factories in Europe, we can't, none of the numbers work out. The fuel is 10 times more expensive now. And I had nothing to tell him.
Well, let's. So we've talked about different price sets, and I think that, but the punchline here, either way, whether we're talking megawatt hours, whether we're talking MMBTUs on the gas, these price spikes are just this is unprecedented in a single day, and what is the root cause of this? I've written about it. Europe's energy suicide. Is that the right term here? What's the one sentence description of what is going on now? How do you, in the shortest possible way, how do you describe what the situation is in Europe vis-a-vis relative to Russia and Ukraine now with regard to energy?
It takes money to make money. It takes energy to make energy. How much energy does it take to make your energy? Well, it depends on how good your energy is. The money, the energy, the effort had to go in previously to make sure you have energy now. And not enough effort and money, it turns out to have gone into producing energy. And now we don't have it.
So was it? So here's what. Let me. The way I've typified this, and it was what I've said, last year when I testified before the Senate. I've written it several times now. Since then, Europe's overinvestment in renewables, underinvestment in hydrocarbons, early closure, crazy closure of their baseload power plants, including coal and nuclear, and overdependence on imports. Is that pretty well cover it?
Yeah. Speaking in rough numbers, because I haven't checked the numbers for early this year or all of last year, but in figurative terms, Europe was using about 15 million barrels of oil a day.
Right.
And they produce about 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. Okay. In terms of natural gas, they're using on the order of 550 billion cubic meters a year.
Right.
And they produce about 250. And when I say Europe, I don't mean EU, I mean the whole continent. So that's right. Norway, big energy producer for Europe, right? The alternative to Russia. So about 550 billion cubic meters a year, and they produce about 250. And it's really hard to store, Robert.
Yeah.
Really hard to store. Expensive and difficult to store. It's expensive and difficult to transport. That's why Germany worked so hard to make it to where they didn't have to store any or much. They built giant pipelines directly between Russia and Germany to let it flow. But that flow has to continue. It has to keep going. Right. And because that flow has been going, it's undercut every other type of energy in the economy except for two. And yeah, I'm not talking about wind and solar. That's not fuel. They come, they go, they come, they go. It's winter. Solar's gone. It's winter. Wind is good sometimes for a month. It's not good today. So that's what the fuel's for, right?
Right.
And none of that is whether anyone's going to invest any money to keep any of that system going, even the solar and wind factories to build those things or to invest in them. All of that's a different problem from the survival today, the disconnect between the survival today, dreams for the future, and actions in the past. That's the best way I'd say we're in this crisis, right? Anyway, so on coal,
but to interrupt you, what you're saying is that this is the fruit of that is being produced of these past inaction, past inattention to the criticality of the energy network.
Well, look, if we want to empathize with bad, dumb, destructive decision making, foolish decision making at the top of European society, if we want to put our head in there, if we dare. What was there to be gained for fighting to spend time, effort, money, political capital on making sure there was enough hydrocarbon production, enough nuclear production, if people didn't care, weren't going to fight for it? I have to respect the Germans for something.
Which is what?
In 2020, their coal fleet operated at about 20% capacity factor. Yeah, that's right. The mightiest coal fleet in Europe, one of the biggest in the world, right? We're talking about a coal fleet of almost 40 gigawatts of capacity, operated at 20% capacity factor. How long would that have lasted in America, operating at that capacity factor?
Not long.
You'd lose half your fleet the next year, yeah?
Right.
The Germans, with some kind of ancient wisdom, were mealy-mouthed about the need for energy like coal in order to justify shutting off their nuclear plants. But they kept their coal fleet, didn't they? They kept it, and now they've got it. All they have to do is spike the carbon price, or they just have to outspend their neighbors in the EU for energy. They have to stay on good enough terms with Russia, if that's going to happen, to keep the gas flowing. And then they will be in a relatively stronger position versus the rest of Europe. So even if all the factories start collapsing all around Europe, Germany may be the last one standing, which is why I've always framed this as a Germany, Russia, regardless of what any of them said, whatever they're doing, it's a recreation of a war by other means, not by other means in Russia at the moment. By war means they're doing war. But in Germany, it was a way of undercutting the other economies around them by inflicting the harmful part of their energy policy on weaker allies that didn't have the productive advantages in the gas pipeline that Germany had, if that makes sense.
Well, so I'm following you here, but what you're implying here is there's some kind of calculus or some kind of strategery behind the Germans here, or this is just luck.
Once they eliminated the cheapest, most secure low carbon energy, nuclear, what was left was effectively economic warfare against Europe that they were willing to invest in, and they were willing to sabotage European energy to achieve. They just didn't expect that Russia would start with the shooting, you see.
They thought it would be more gradual. And then let's talk about Germany then. And you've written about this. I've written about it. Just on December 31st, the Germans closed the Brockdorf, the Gronda, and Grunde-Remagen nuclear plants. That's 3 plants. How many gigawatts was that? 3, 4, 5 gigawatts
it's
altogether?
Just over 4 gigawatts. And think about this. The Germans have winnowed their reactor fleets down to the finest individual reactors on planet Earth by some metrics. The finest of German engineering, the culmination of 40 years of engineering, culture, and achievement are in those remaining reacters. Yeah. There are 3 plants left. Is that right? And we're talking production costs at 20 or less than 20 euros a megawatt hour.
Right.
Okay. And the quantity is about 4 gigawatts of capacity that was closed only 2 infinitely long months ago. Right. And then they're supposed to close another 4 gigawatts of the finest reactors on planet Earth in another 9 months.
Well, so then, but let's talk about
it's 8 gigawatts total. That's
right.
About 60 terawatt hours total.
Right.
That's about 12% of all the electricity in Germany. But in terms of solid fuel predictable electricity that comes from German production, like German mining or German domestic production, it's like 40%.
Huh. Okay. So, but about those 3 reactors or 3 plants that have closed now, Brockdorf, Gronda, and Grunde-Remagen, can they be salvaged now? They were closed on December 31st. Can they go back and say, "Oh, just kidding. We want to restart those"? Can they do that now, or have they already scrapped them and gone past the point of no return?
Yes, they can.
They can be saved.
Yes, they can, and I'm not guessing.
Explain.
I'm in touch with people there who are very upset at what was done to their facilities. They can't speak up because they're German and they have superiors and they have orders. And Germans follow orders. We know this. Doesn't matter whether they're good orders or bad orders. They follow them. And so they've communicated what their plants would require to return to operation. The very, very approximate math is this: about 100 million per plant for emergency life extension for the 3 that are on, and up to, but not probably much higher than, about €1 billion per plant to resurrect the 3. It's probable that it'd be lower cost for some of it. It depends on how much damage has already been done to the facilities.
So they can revive those 3 plants that were closed on December 31st for a total cost of about $3 billion. And then
I would put that as the cap. The cap.
$3 billion, or the euros, they're in fairly close proximity now. But
in other words, if you had to replace a huge number of the components to satisfy a nervous regulator, you would be needing to spend a lot to do emergency rapid manufacturing and you would need to fabricate a bunch of parts. You'd need to do rush orders of fuels. You needed to do big bonuses and rehiring programs, that sort of thing, right? Employee retention programs.
Right.
That would be expensive. But expensive, we opened this talking about $435 a metric ton of Newcastle coal. Yeah, no, it's not that expensive. We've already run the numbers, by the way, at about, conservatively, about 20 euros per megawatt hour for the currently operating reactors.
Versus 400
life extension, if
10x,
we could guarantee
12x,
them, if we could guarantee 5 years at least of operation, that adds about 10% of production cost compared to not having had closures and just rolling on, right? So that's about $22 a megawatt hour is going to be the ongoing cost. And the amortized cost of the 100 million euro payment to have the option of keeping gives you about 10% higher, about 22 euros a megawatt hour. Electricity prices, contract prices for this year in Germany are about 250 euros a megawatt hour.
So it's 10 to 20 times cheaper than going on to revive them than to keep them closed then and over the long term for electricity production.
Oh no, that's not over the long term. We have no clue what's going to happen in the long term. Just what we can see today.
Okay, fair enough.
Here's another way to look at it. How long does one of the reactors that's on today have to continue operation compared to natural gas prices to have paid 100 million euros to pay for itself, right?
Right.
Last night, it was about 14 days. Now it's about 10 days of operation total to pay for the 100 million euro cost of continuing life.
It's just incredible. I mean, it just is. I mean, it's among the most amazing developments I've seen in my lifetime.
I mean, again, like at this point, screw the environment. The most environmentally conscious countries in the world are scrambling to gather every last dust mote of coal that can be found, every bit of like cow fart and bio, like anything to get energy. Robert, it's not going to necessarily happen by legal means. We're going to see a lot of forest cover go away from Europe this year. I bet deforestation has already started in earnest. Everything that you and I have fought against in our careers, you're not so much like an environmentalist like I've been, but we've been fighting this moment. I've been seeing it coming. Almost every forest in the world, in the northern hemisphere, outside of Russia, was cut down completely. Everything, every single tree we see now is a regrowth from having been clear cut. The few forests in Europe where that isn't true are a few square kilometers, and they are famous for being the only trees that weren't cut.
Right.
Everywhere else got cut to the ground, and we're going back to that. From a Europe that claims all these things about the environment or whatever. A comment that I keep having to make is that something very dangerous happened in European leadership when energy departments got turned into ecology departments. So there's a more serious problem with European leadership, okay? The generations that built the power plants, whether they be nuclear or coal, they're gone now. They're mostly gone. The leaders who are at the top of society, who used to have departments of war that are now departments of defense with no armies, or their ministries of energy, have now been turned into ministries of ecology.
Right.
In France, which we consider to be a great nuclear nation, with the most amazing nuclear fleet in the world, it's being decimated now by the caretaker generation that manages it. It was built by people who, as teenagers, fought in the French resistance and were ashamed at their elders surrendering and collaborating with Nazi Germany,
right.
Deporting their own neighbors, right? So watching that were young people who grew up to build the most spectacular nuclear fleet the world's ever seen. That nuclear fleet is managed by a ministry of the ecological transition, as in the very ministry and minister who's supposed to manage the French nuclear fleet has the name of getting rid of it.
Of the ecological transition.
Yeah, and they put like former journalists there, and they put like like, people have studied like some philosophy about how to think about an ecology scenario,
Right.
like complete bogusness, where if they've even touched on science, it's likely to be a pseudoscience like ecology, right? So it's fake. And they put them in charge of the nuclear fleet. And sure enough, they don't know what units are used for, like what's a megawatt or kilowatt hour, or like what's a ton of coal, or where does fossil fuels come from. They just don't. It wasn't even a concern for qualifications for having responsibility over energy. None. It did not matter until now.
So what I hear you saying, I'm going to play back to you what you've been saying, is just that this is a result of just a complete lack of seriousness of understanding the fundamental nature of energy and its importance to society. You and I have talked about John Constable. He's been on the podcast, and he warned about this. He said this is that we're not taking this seriously enough, and we could see. He didn't say societal collapse, but he said all the progress we've made could unwind very, very quickly. Is that what we're seeing now? I mean, just that Europe suddenly is finding
machines to make. Yeah, sorry. It takes machines to make machines. It takes energy to make energy. We've had quite continuous culture in a lot of those. So there, if we have to end on an optimistic note, yes, unwinding can happen. If you lose the grid, it's really hard to come back from that. I've been watching with trepidation as some countries like South Africa struggled with whether they were going to make it back or not make it. South Africa's not in a good trajectory. It really isn't. And there's these donors and donor nations from around the world trying to put up money, because the ministers in South Africa are evidently willing, I guess, to bribe them with billions of dollars in wind turbines or whatever to close their coal plants when they're having blackouts now.
Right.
They're having load shedding now, and people are stepping up with 10 billion to get them to close some of their final working power plants.
Same thing's happening in Australia. They're already talking about the same in Australia. I mean, but it's just
but Australia is about to be incredibly rich on commodities, aren't they?
Well, fair enough. But let's. I know you're constrained on time, and I am as well today. But I mean, is there reason for where we are now? And today's the March 2nd, and Ukraine is in the world of hurt. Is there anything here that gives you optimism as you look at this going, over the next few weeks with that Russia hasn't destroyed the Ukrainian energy grid, the pipelines have been spared so far. Is there any room for optimism right now, or are you expecting things to get worse from here?
Yeah, there's room for optimism. All those factories that need to leave Europe, we're going to get a bunch of them. We've got a lot of energy.
They're going to come to the U.S.
Yeah, there was $300 billion of money burned in the shale revolution. Okay. However, we can think of that as a donation now. A donation to America to be this is the optimism, the preserve of low cost energy to rebuild a Europe that's about to be devastated.
The deindustrialization.
We're going to have to get our act together on nuclear. We are really bad. We have not had probably the best people join nuclear. We have not really been taking it seriously. We've had too big of a gap between the owner, the customer, the contractor, our engineer, the architect, the vendor. It's been an absolute mess. But I think we're going to see a generation of young people flood into nuclear. Strong young people flood into nuclear with almost a religious zeal, inspired by what we're about to see unfold in Europe. So there's our optimism.
I like that. Mark Nelson, many thanks for taking some time. Mark is the managing director of the Radiant Energy Fund. You can find him on Twitter at EnergyBants, just like it sounds, Energy BANTS. Mark, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Sure, Robert.
And thanks to all of you. Tune in. I'm going to have another couple shows on the Ukrainian crisis and energy issues, so stay tuned. Until then, next time.